This happened to me in June 2019. I had turned 17 a month earlier, and I was mentoring a group at a summer camp. The events of this story take place in Angela, southern Finland. There's an old manor in the school centre where the camp was held. The manor is really beautiful, built in the 17th century, I guess. Very much ghost house material. It's surrounded by a forest and there are two roads that lead to the front yard. The manor is open for visitors, and for that 1 week, our camp instructors had a key to the back door. There was another summer camp at the same time with us, because the school centre was so big, and we shared the key with them. We spent time in the mansion almost every evening, doing activities such as singing and playing. One night, when I was going to bed, I realised that I had forgotten my phone inside the manor. It was necessary for me to get it back. I had woken up alarms and I had to call home, so I went to the camp instructor's flat to get the keys. Unfortunately, they had given the keys to the other camp's night watch and I had to find her. Because the school centre was quite large and I had no flashlight, it took me a while to find her. While giving me the keys, the night watch told me she had seen some movement in the edge of the field. The school centre was surrounded by fields and forests, and the edge of the field was where the forest began and where the manor was located. I noted that, but I didn't think of it that much when time passed. It took me 5 minutes to get to the manor. The front yard was dark because it was sometime between 11 p.m. and 12 a.m. I went straight to the back of the manor. I think one important thing to note is the fact that the backyard was wide. There were no trees, only grass, so I was fully visible when searching the back door. The only door I found was the one that I had been using during the evening activities, but that door could only be opened from the inside. The whole time, I had felt kind of strange, probably because of what the night watch had told me. But standing alone on the veranda at night in the back of an empty mansion, I suddenly had a feeling that someone was watching me. Because I'm young and have no chill, and I didn't even know where the right door was, I decided to go to the building where I stayed with other mentors, and then have my friend go back to the manor with me. I left the manor without looking back because the atmosphere was disturbing. My friend was still awake, so I asked her to come with me to get my phone. On our way to the manor, she told me that the right back door was actually a side door, and it was located in the edge of the forest. We hadn't even arrived at the front yard of the manor when we saw it. 3 figures moving fast from the back of the manor all the way across the front yard and then disappearing to the forest. We just stood there and held our breath. Those guys obviously hadn't seen us because they just vanished. Me and my friend waited for them to come back, but because they didn't show up, we continued our way to the manor. After this, we spent like 15 minutes inside the building, but my phone wasn't there. So we left and gave the keys back to the night watch. We also told her what we had seen, and she called the guards, but they didn't find anyone. I did find my phone. It was under a couch in the building I stayed in. I don't know what I saw that night. It all happened so fast. But I think the figures in the forest were waiting for someone to show up and open the manor doors so they could go in. When I arrived there alone, they probably thought that that was their time. But since I couldn't open the door and left, they must have thought that I was just checking the locks or something, and then they left. All I can think about now is what could have happened if I had managed to open the doors at first try. The manor is huge, and it's far from any other building on that site. This happened in late 2020. I live in a 2-bedroom, a hall and a kitchen apartment, in a group of apartment buildings arranged in a rectangle, with all buildings connected to each other by a common terrace. Our apartment is on the 5th floor, the top floor of one of those buildings. Both the bedrooms have a balcony attached to it, separated by a door. Balconies of all apartments face inside the rectangle formed by the buildings. It remains surprisingly quiet, even though the buildings are in a pretty busy part of the city. Both balconies have a clothesline running on its outer side. We keep a small bucket full of cloth pegs and clips. We keep this bucket in one of the balconies. It's usually left in one where we last dried some clothes. We have installed wire nets in both balconies to stop pigeons from entering, as there are many pigeons in the area. They usually destroy plants and sometimes hurt themselves with stuff lying around on balconies. Note that after installing those nets, we never had an incident of a pigeon entering the balcony again, as those nets were tightly fitted with no gaps large enough for any pigeon to enter. Until that day. I live with my parents. Me and my mum were the only people in our apartment. Dad leaves for work early in the morning. My mum was doing daily chores. I was doing some freelance coding working at the time. So I had my laptop on the study table in my room, and I was working on it, on a client's project. The bucket of pegs/clips was on the balcony attached to my room. I knew this because I saw it earlier in the morning when I went to the balcony. Early in the morning, Mom had hung some clothes to dry on my balcony, so the bucket had some pegs left in it. Sometime before noon, I suddenly started hearing the sound of clothes pegs being dropped on the floor, one by one on the balcony, at a weirdly constant tempo. At first, I thought that it was my mom taking dried clothes off the clothesline. She had the habit of just throwing the pegs on the floor instead of aiming for the bucket, when in a hurry. But when she came to my room after she heard the sounds as well, I realised it was something else. Maybe a pigeon might have managed to get through the net. So we both headed towards the balcony door, and as soon as we turned the doorknob, the sound stopped. We very much expected to see a pigeon flapping around, trying to find the gap again. But as we opened the door, we saw there was nothing in the balcony. Just pegs scattered on the floor, and a few left inside the bucket. No pigeon or anything else. Not even the sound of a pigeon flapping and flying away. Just complete silence. My mom said it must be a pigeon, but honestly, I don't know if it was. Firstly, there's no way a pigeon can get past the nets. Also, the level at which the pegs were in the bucket was very low. It would be very hard for a pigeon to reach that deep in a bucket while sitting on the edge. And if it was inside the bucket, it would be impossible for it to fly away silently without us noticing it in the time it did. It should have made at least some noise from flapping its wings or from its paws against the plastic bucket and pegs. If we consider that it was indeed a pigeon, then from the moment we installed the nets in balconies till now, that was the only time a pigeon managed to get past the net, and also managed to leave without us seeing it. Some backstory. In 1980, my mum was heading to a basketball game with her two friends. Her friend Dawn was driving, 16 years old, and missed a turn on an old Montana road during the night and went into the fields. Seatbelts weren't really a thing. Dawn died on impact. My mum was in the middle seat, and she went flying through the windshield. The other girl took the least of the crash and was able to walk to a farmhouse and get help. My mum doesn't remember being ejected. Before this year, she told me about the story before, but just the bare minimum, that her friend had died in an accident. This year, I asked her more about it, because I've always been drawn to Dawn. She mentioned that after the accident, she was put on antidepressants. She experienced glowing orbs flying around her room within the first few weeks after the accident. Since then, she's been terrified of antidepressants. I think the orb was her friend telling her it was okay, and she was safe and not to be sad. Months after learning about the incident, just this week, I found a yearbook from the year she died. It was the first time I learned her full name and saw her face. Today, I heard a carpenter's song and immediately wanted to paint. The image in my head was a golden field with a road and canyons in the background. I was listening to 70s music and then Dawn came into my head. The next song was Driver's Seat Sniffing the Tears. The lyrics reminded me that Dawn was driving, so I checked to see the song name and noticed the time was 11:11, an angel number. The The song mentions a Saturday night drive and blue news. So out of curiosity, I checked to see what night the crash was on. It was a Saturday night. Then the next song that played was Saturday Night, Bay City Rollers. The playlist is a random shuffle Spotify playlist called 70s Hits that I've never played before. I feel immensely sad for her, and I found out that I have a guardian angel 3 years ago. I didn't know who it could have, but now I believe it to be her. When I was in my early 20s, my parents bought a new house 2 hours away from where I lived. It was a 2-story home near the ocean, with the bedrooms upstairs and the living areas downstairs. After they had settled in, I went to visit them and stayed the night in the spare bedroom. Everything seemed normal when I went to bed, and sleeping somewhere new has never bothered me, so I fell asleep easily. I woke up during the night and heard someone walking around upstairs. The floors were timber, so I could clearly hear footsteps walking down the hall and around the stairwell. I checked my phone. It was 3 a.m. I assumed one of my parents had gotten up to get a drink, so I thought nothing of it. Minutes passed, and the footsteps continued. After 10 minutes, I got up to see what was happening. Neither of my parents were sleepwalkers, so I wondered if something was wrong. I opened the door to a pitch black hallway. I stood there for a moment and could no longer hear footsteps. I went to look in my parents' room as their bedroom door down the hall was ajar. Both my parents were asleep in bed. I assumed whichever of them had got up had gone back to bed as soon as I opened the spare room door, so I went back to bed and thought nothing of it. I had trouble falling back asleep. I had laid in bed feeling like something was off. I told myself that timber floors creak all the time, so it was probably just in my head that it sounded like footsteps. As I started to close my eyes, I heard it again. The creaking of footsteps on the upstairs timber floors. I went cold. I told myself one of my parents was awake. That was all. Just go back to sleep. But I couldn't. I heard one of them slowly walk down the hall and to the stairwell. This time, the footsteps were much louder, like they were stomping. I got up immediately, willing myself to open the door to check. To prove to my overactive imagination that this was just one of my parents going to get something. I opened the spare room door and the stomping abruptly stopped. Once again, I stared into the pitch black hallway, although this time I had a gut-wrenching feeling something was staring back at me. It made me feel cold inside. I turned on the bedroom light, illuminating the hallway. It was empty. I went to my parents' room, and again they were both still asleep. I went to the stairwell and couldn't see anyone, so I started walking back to where the spare room, when I heard the footsteps now downstairs. I froze, thinking someone had broken into the house. I ran back to the spare room to get my phone to call the police if the footsteps continued. As I entered the spare room and closed the door behind me, I instantly heard loud thumping footsteps upstairs, hastily moving towards the spare room door. I was paralyzed with fear. The footsteps stopped right outside the spare room door. My whole body was cold. Whoever was in the house was now standing directly outside the spare room, inches away from where I stood, on the other side of the door. I stood there for what felt like hours, but I finally got up the nerve to open the door. I held my hand on the door handle and told myself as a logical explanation that I don't know the sounds this new house makes, that it would make no sense for there to be a person standing in the hallway waiting at my door, and that I was safe. But I didn't feel safe. I turned the door handle and looked out into a completely empty, dark hallway. I took a deep breath, closed the door, and listened. Nothing. No footsteps. I turned the bedroom light off, got into bed, and sat staring at the door until sunrise. No matter how many times I told myself I'm safe, I was still too petrified to sleep or move. No more footsteps, Light finally started filling in through the bedroom window. It was morning. When I finally could hear my parents stir, I went out to talk to them about what had happened during the night, expecting them to tell me it's just a creaky house, or to laugh at how silly I was to be scared. But that's not what happened. When I explained to my mum what I heard, she replied, "Oh, that's the man who used to live here, who walks around sometimes." I looked at her in shock and disbelief. I yelled back, "What the hell do you mean? Like he still has a key and comes into the house? That's insane. Mum, why haven't you told someone? Called the police?" To which my mum replied very casually, "No, honey, he died here. He was leaving for vacation with his wife one day. They had packed their bags and the taxi had just arrived out the front. He picked up the bags, walked to the stairwell, and tripped on the top flight of stairs. He broke his neck falling down the stairs and died instantly. The real estate had to disclose it to us when we bought the house. What they didn't tell us is that he still walks around at night." I stood there staring at my mother, trying to fathom what she had just said, and how calmly she had said it. She continued, "Don't worry, he won't hurt you. We usually hear him walking to the stairwell, leaving the house for his holiday." Safe to say, I never stayed at my parents' new house again. So let's kick it back to around 6 years ago, and I'm around 11 years old. I sleep with my door closed to my room all the time, because I don't like my dog jumping on my bed at midnight, scaring the daylights out of me, no matter how much I love her. But that month, my door would begin rattling as I laid in bed. Like something was trying to grab onto the knob or push the door open, but just wasn't strong enough or able to get a good enough grip on it, and it would make my door just kind of rattle back and forth. It would go on for a short bit, but it would eventually subside after a max of probably 2 minutes of rattling, leaving me sitting there thinking, what the hell? I'm trying to force myself back to sleep. This was going on for several nights in a row. I bet there were more happenings that I'd managed to sleep through, but I always remembered waking up to the noise and just staring at the door as it did its thing. So, I eventually got sick of all this nonsense, and suspect it's my dog leaning and pressing against my door, trying to get in. I decided it was better to know it's her than be in fear, wondering, and that I was losing sleep. I still get chills just thinking about this, and this story is the biggest reason I still sleep with a nightlight and believe in ghosts. So that night, it's pretty standard bedtime procedure. Brush teeth, make bed, crawl in, nighty-night, and I sleep for a few good hours, before I suddenly wake up to a voice whispering in the night. Some real cryptic horror movie bullshit. Kind of like the whispering at the end of the Gravity Falls theme song. I just kind of sit there listening to it and start to look around the room and then towards my open door. There he is, standing there in the doorway. A shadow. A silhouette of a very tall man standing there in the doorway that was darker than the darkness around him. Very easy to distinguish just standing outside my room. I, having no idea what's going on, just ask, "Dad?" And it stops. Dead fucking silence for a good 3 seconds as me and it are staring each other down. Then it slides out of the doorway to the left in a fluidness that isn't natural in any way, shape or form. And like that, it's gone. It's 3 a.m. Dead silent. Just me, my bed and the night. Still scares the shit out of me to this day. I grew up in a pretty old house. It was about 115 years old at the time. It was a 2-story Victorian in Minnesota, with a dirt basement that my parents had renovated before I was born. My dad was always a skeptic when it came to ghosts, but while he would stay late renovating it, he would get the overwhelming feeling of being watched. One night while installing new kitchen cabinets, he felt eyes on him again, decided he'd had enough and said loudly, "You're gonna like it when it's finished." Immediately, he felt calm and didn't have that terrible feeling after that. Once my parents moved into the house, whatever it was seemed to stick around, sometimes causing unexplained noises and such. My mum, being the curious person she is, looked into the history of the house and found a lady named Corin had died in the house. Also, according to rumours, Karen had been known in the neighbourhood Cat Lady and took in all of the stray cats, and her cause of death was cat scratch fever. I've since done my own research and have found no proof of this. After learning this information, my mum and dad started to, somewhat jokingly, call this ghost Corin, assuming she was the one haunting it. One day, my dad was watching football and had the TV on very loud. My mum yelled jokingly, "Turn that TV down or Corin will get you." My dad laughed and said she can't do anything. And at that moment, the TV turned off and there was a knock at the door. My dad was stunned and jumped up to open the door, but nobody was there. Keep in mind, the front door is right next to the TV in the living room, and the huge wraparound porch is also a good 6 feet off the ground. Whoever knocked would have had to go down steps and down the driveway, all of which you can see from the door, basically making it impossible. Right as my dad, confused, shut the door, the TV came back on. My mom said he silently walked over to the couch, sat down, and lowered the volume. When I was a little bit older, my grandparents moved into the downstairs bedroom. One night, my grandmother woke up to someone touching her foot. She looked up to see a woman dressed in a white nightgown walking away from the bed, going out the door and up the stairs, while the rest of the family was still sleeping. My whole family thinks this was Corin. Another experience happened to me when I was 5, but it wasn't the cat lady. Instead, I woke up to a man standing in my doorway. I stared at him for a second and I was so terrified I couldn't speak. He looked like he had a bell in his hand, but I still don't know for sure. It was really weird. I called for my dad finally, and I watched him run into my room and go right through the intruder. I never saw that ghost again, and there wasn't a whole lot of notable activity from the cat lady other than knocks, footsteps, and other boring stuff. We moved out of that house when I was about 6, so I don't have any recent stories. However, in 2011, my family moved to Maryland, where my parents' families are. One night, we spent the night at my uncle's house. His house is pretty old, but he also collects antiques, so there's always a creepy feeling to it. Not bad, not good, just creepy. My parents were sleeping in the guest bedroom upstairs while my sister, who was 11 at the time, and I had to sleep in the living room downstairs. From the living room, we could see the bottom of the stairs and across to the library, which always had a creepy vibe. And right around the corner was the kitchen. It was around midnight, and my sister and I were half awake, when suddenly we heard noises in the kitchen. This person was moving pots around, opening cabinets and drawers, walking around as if they were making a 3-course dinner. But there was one problem. The lights were off everywhere in the house. We would have seen the lights in the kitchen if they were on. We would have heard someone coming down the stairs, but it was completely dark. I whispered to my sister, "Do you hear that?" And she just said softly, "Yes." And that was it. We both just kind of tried to sleep as if nothing happened. I really don't know why we both did that. Thinking back on it is really terrifying. It went on for a good 20 minutes of cabinets opening and closing, pots and pans rattling, and footsteps moving around. It stopped eventually, and we slept through the night without any more events. In the morning, I woke my sister up and asked her if she remembered anything. She said she did, and relayed the events. I had to make sure it wasn't a dream. And we still both remember this happening. My grandmother lived with my uncle for a bit after my grandfather died, and she would constantly hear footsteps going up and down the stairs and noises in the kitchen. So it's a pretty active house. Jump to 2013, my parents got divorced, so I lived with my mom most of the time. She rented a townhouse that was fairly new, nothing creepy about it. But I could feel an energy in my bedroom. It wasn't evil, I could just tell something was there. One morning, around 5 a.m., I woke up and saw a shadow of a man standing over me. He had a top hat on, and I could tell he was staring at me. I blinked a couple of times and he was still there. I covered my face with a blanket and waited a while. When I peeked out again, he wasn't there. I got out of bed and ran to my mom's room. I told her what I had seen, and she didn't even look surprised. She said that the owner of the house's sick husband had died in my room. She hadn't told me because she didn't want to freak me or my sister out, who I shared the room with. My sister never saw anything in that room, and that was the only time I saw him. I still don't know what the top hat was about. So yeah, those are the most exciting stories in my family. Others include my other uncle's house being haunted by the KIA US soldier that grew up there. And my other uncle, I have three, and they all have haunted houses, whose ghost liked to sing to my cousin when she was a baby and drag furniture across the floor. I was raised and live in a portion of Tennessee that's still relatively rural by an old farming family, of whom 99% of the family was Southern Baptist, and all attended the same church and had for generations. This was a multi-room, picturesque white church, smack on a bend in a road miles away from anything other than farms and sporadic houses. The church has occupied that property for 150 years now, and that building had burnt down once around 130 years previously. My mother was not religious and didn't go, so my aunt and uncle were determined to make me into a good little Southern Christian. It clearly didn't work, but I digress. My aunt was the kitchen lady, in charge of dinners, breakfasts, that sort of thing. So more often than not, my uncle would drop us off with supplies to cook and prepare the dining room extremely early on Sunday mornings, where we would be having a meal after the service. I'm talking 5-6 a.m. early. He'd unlock the side door, take the key with him, and leave to get a few more hours of sleep while we worked. My first experience was around 8 years old, and it happened when my aunt told me to go turn on all the lights in the building and unlock the doors for other congregations to start coming in. The dining room was connected to the rest of the church by a long hallway, which had 2 Sunday school rooms, 2 bathrooms, and 2 entries into the back of the main worship room, as an H junction, with a tiny library/storage room on the left entry, and a set of stairs to the baptismal on the right entry. The light of the baptismal was the small series of stairs to get inside the pool itself, and I climbed 2 of those steps and reached around for the light switch, and felt a hand grab my own. Like anyone would, I freaked out, fell backwards off the stairs and booked it back to the kitchen where I was chastised for making up a story as I tried to explain the scream and running. That church would try to put in security systems and whatnot, but they never worked right, and every security company would refuse to work with them after a while due to electrical issues. As time went on, I had quite a few more experiences in that building, and now as an adult of 27, around that property as well. A shadow figure, roughly 7 foot tall, staring me down in the hallway one night, after helping clean up from a wedding when I was 10. I would see that figure quite a few more times before I stopped attending. Hair pulled repeatedly throughout that hallway at various ages, until I chopped it off completely at 15. A face of an angry old and wrinkled man staring at myself and 3 more girls from the baptismal pool itself. All 3 promptly never walked in the connecting area again. Had doors slammed from various parts of the building, most often the double doors connecting the vestibule to the main worship room. Saw bright red orb-like lights swinging around in the hallway and windows. I've since seen those lights in the fields around that church when driving home at night in bunches of 10-ish. Heard murmuring often enough, I tuned it out until someone else would ask if I heard someone talking. Constantly felt like I was being watched by someone who would love to throttle me, and felt breathing on my neck practically every time I set foot in there. That church was abandoned a few years ago because of some drama that caused the place to shut down. They've tried to sell the building, but nobody ever wants it for long before they pack up and leave with no warning whatsoever. I feel like whatever's in there is happiest when left alone, and I'm very grateful I don't have to deal with that mess anymore. In the fall of '98, I started college, 18 years old and fresh to the real world. I had a few night classes that I had taken because they were offered in my hometown. I had to travel to take my other classes. It saved me a little money to do it. One of my teachers I didn't vibe with at all, and decided I was going to skip her class and go on a road trip with my friends one night. When I say road trip, I mean drive around and smoke weed all evening. We were veteran tokers at this point, so no BS or getting sick or scared, and we weren't the type to overdo it with anything. We lived in a small town, and there wasn't anything to do. Now, I don't condone driving while intoxicated, of any type. We were young and dumb at the time, but just imagine a place with a few gas stations and a few crappy fast food places. A stop in the middle of nowhere off an interstate you've never been down, with plenty of roads surrounding it that aren't travelled a lot. Just a lot of old country roads. Perfect for not being seen. So after several hours of young guys driving around the back roads, smoking joints and telling lies, we decided to get something to eat and call it a night. We were in good shape as far as how high we were. The driver had only taken a few tokes when we first started out on this adventure. We're getting closer to town, and there was only one more huge turn. It's like one of those kiss your ass turns before the driving got easier. You have to slow down to come through this one cleanly. Just as we're approaching, an early 90s model Chevy S10 type truck comes bouncing through this huge curve. This thing is going so fast it looks like a rock skipping on water sideways. My friends and I are in a Chevy Monte Carlo. I'm in the back, sitting in the middle, so I have a very clear view of this. The last thing I remember seeing is the truck in our lane and our bumper inches from each other. My friend that was driving had nowhere to go off the road to the right. It was about a 20 to 25 foot drop into a field. The angle the truck was coming at us, turning left, may have put us in this path still. A huge hillside almost straight up that met the left side of the road. The turn broke around this hillside. This was one of those life flashes before your eyes type moments. I could see the ambulance arriving in my head in that second. This was not going to be good. I felt the heat coming off the headlights in my face. I closed my eyes and braced myself for impact. I heard my friend scream, and then nothing. Complete silence. We were all inaudible, trying to communicate, but too shook up to get the words out. Gibberish and a bunch of loud dude and dude, what the fuck. The car was stopped. We got out to look for this truck that had to have gone off the road to the right of us. From the direction we had come was straight behind us. We could see a car travelling that way. The truck hadn't passed us and went that way. On the left side of the road was a hillside almost straight up, and not getting up there. We don't see any headlights off the right side of the road. Being where we live, people used to keep handheld spotlights in our cars and trucks to see where deer were bedding down at night. There's nothing off the road to the right. These spotlights can light up several acres at a time and nothing. No markings on the hillside to the left. No car parts strung across the road anywhere. There isn't a place to turn off for a while behind us. Just a straight road for about half a mile before it starts winding again. It's several minutes before you could turn off into the next holler. So we get back in the car and go as fast as we can, driving to catch up with this truck. At this point, it's for our own sanity to find where it went. We travelled to the end of that road and never saw another vehicle. No one passed us or us catching up to the truck. There were several small houses we passed and no truck in the driveway. We turned up the only hollow on the road, 2 small houses, and no truck in the driveway. We came to the conclusion that, as crazy as it sounds, it was either a ghost truck or some sort of divine intervention, because this truck went through us and disappeared. There's no way that it missed us. My friend in the passenger seat claims to this day his eyes were open the whole time, and says it disappeared right after we should have felt the impact. I work at a nursing home in Corpus Christi, Texas. It's a higher end one, and it's probably the most expensive one around. I started working there almost a year ago. Since I've started here, I've heard many stories about the little boy. Residents, mostly on one side of the building, report having interactions with the little boy. The problem is, this little boy, to the best of our knowledge, is a ghost. At first, I didn't believe the stories. I believe in ghosts, but don't automatically believe every ghost story I've ever been told. The stories I heard were always the same. The kid shows up and is loud. Sometimes there's a girl with him. Sometimes there's a mom involved, but his dad is never around. Sometimes the mom abandons him. My girlfriend, who worked here before me, said that a resident said she was adopting the little boy because his dad was dead and his mother was terrible to him. The stories were all similar and creepy, but I still was skeptical. My first direct interaction with the boy was when a resident of ours broke his hip. We were changing him after he had a BM, and he's in pain, and he says, "Fix this, fix that," and it's just generally making complaints. I say, "Okay, sir, we'll get on it after we're done helping you." And he replies, "Can you do something about those damn kids?" I freaked out, because this man had never been told the stories and was a retired PhD holding professor, and was far from the type to tell ghost stories. When I probed, he said that they'd come into his room at night, and they're loud and leave a mess. This, mind you, is the exact hall where all of the reported activity occurs. My next interaction was a couple of weeks later. I was sitting down that hall with my co-worker, and we had wheeled our resident to the window down that hall to get some light. She was mostly non-verbal, but that day she spoke. She said, "That poor baby." When I asked her to explain, she said, "I'm going to take care of him. Your heart has to go out to him. His dad is dead, and his mother doesn't want him." At this point, I should let you know that every time this kid was spotted, deaths started to happen. It wasn't always the people who saw the kid, but if someone saw him, I knew 3 people were about to pass away. If you've worked in this kind of facility, you know the "death comes in threes" saying is scarily accurate. I've come to the conclusion that I think this kid is actually death, like literal Grim Reaper death. I think he shows up as a kid to not scare the residents, and I think his story is to make them trust him. I just got into work at 3 o'clock. It's 4:28 as I write this, and I had another interaction with him around 3:30. My favourite resident moved from one end of the building into the side with the ghost activity. She's sweet and a retired elementary teacher. She's never suffered from any kind of dementia or anything like that. I'm taking laundry down that hallway and I hear her yell. I rush in and she's standing without her walker, something I didn't even know she could do. She was wobbly and yelling to get her the wheelchair. She said that little boy was just standing there watching me fall and wouldn't hand me my chair. After she calmed down, I asked her to describe the boy. She said he could have passed as either Anglo or Hispanic. He had beautiful skin but had dark circles around his eyes. His sister was with him, and I heard his mother yelling for him to come back after you walked in. I was literally in the room with him. I'm mildly freaked out. I'm now just waiting to find out who's going to pass away. When I was younger,
I'm talking from the ages of 0 to 6. My family and I lived in this house in Creston, Iowa. I'll never forget that place. It was 2 stories, the attic was technically 3 bedrooms, and mine was the one up the stairs. Go up the stairs through my brother's bedroom, hang a left through the parents' room, and to the back. Picture a bedroom with slanted walls and 2 windows in the back. That was my room. A bedroom, through a bedroom, to a bedroom. The layout of this place made 0 sense. It also had a basement that, from my very vague memory, never stopped flooding. Not sure what that has to do with the story, but I'd like to know what happened to this place. I remember a little road that, if you followed it around the back, you'd go under this tunnel bridge that supported trains. If you'd look out the side window from the kitchen, you can see the public baseball fields. I'm 32 now, and my brother is 29, and we still have dreams about this nightmare for children. Every night when I would go to sleep, I would see these glowing eyes in my windows. 2 sets of them on occasion, like it brought its friggin' buddy to come peep on this 5-year-old in the second-story window. I would tell Mom all the time. To this day, she thinks I made it up. She gave me the typical mom response and told me to stand up to my fears. I did. Once. That night I yelled, "Go away!" And the body that the eyes were attached to started to frantically try to open the window. I had them locked, of course. Wouldn't go to bed without me locked. As soon as the growling and rattling started, I gunned it to my brother's room, and the little guy was floating out of his crib. I go to my mom's bed while having one of those throat dry, can't scream moments, trying to push her awake. My father comes walking up the stairs, and my brother falls back in his crib. Dad hears him screaming, and me standing there crying, and reaching for him, and he puts us both back to sleep. I didn't sleep. About a week went by that I didn't sleep, and Mum invited my grandparents to stay the night. My grandpa was apparently the only thing that could calm me. That old geezer made me feel safe, you know? On the 3rd night of his stay, the eyes were back, so I went downstairs to snuggle up to my grandpa while he's asleep on the couch. When I rounded the corner, I could see something black floating up through his stomach and up through the ceiling. He's gasping for air and begging something above his head to make it stop. I was so freaked I froze. The next morning, I asked him about it. He said an angel was patting his head, telling him it was going to be okay. It's almost over. My brother was 3 and I was 5. My grandparents are all past now. There's no way we should still be seeing this shit in our sleep by the time we're 30. I want to know if that place is still standing, and if anything happened to anyone else who stayed there. I'd just like to know if it wasn't just us. A year ago, my girlfriend and I had just moved into this nice little studio apartment in Munich. The building had a twin right in front, separated by a garden about 15 meters wide. Our apartment's balcony looked down into this garden. On one end of the garden was a street through which a team went by, and on the other end was a 3rd apartment building. At the corner of the building in front and the building to the side, there was a small entranceway from a 2nd street and into the garden. This other street was small, had a sidewalk, and you could see only a little bit of it through the gap between the 2 buildings. I'll explain this in detail, since it will become important later on. A couple of nights after moving in, I was awoken at up around 3 a.m. by a sound that can only be described as a stack of metallic plates banging against one another, or as if someone had put a bunch of cutlery in a bag and shaked it in a very rhythmic fashion. I thought, that's odd, and went back to sleep. During the next couple of weeks, this kept happening almost every night, at the exact same hour. I noticed also that the sound seemed to cross the garden from one end to the other. It faded in, became intense, almost as if it was right in front of my apartment, and then faded out the other end. Eventually, my girlfriend heard it one night as she was getting some water and became scared shitless too. After some time, my curiosity became bigger than my patience. At this point, I was even waking up on my own around that hour, sometimes even a few seconds before the sound went by. One night, I get up, go into the balcony, and wait. A minute later or so, I hear it. I look down into the garden right as it's going by, and I see nothing. Now, I've never believed in the paranormal before. I'm your run-of-the-mill rational dude, but this got me baffled. I couldn't even come up with one single logical explanation. The sound seemed to come out of nowhere. I then jump over into the supernatural, and the only possible explanation I could come up with is that this had to be a ghost of some medieval knight or soldier or some shit. Full clad in armour and all. I mean, what the hell else could produce a sound like that? The next night, I wake up again and wait on the balcony, ready to see the best ghost story unfold before my eyes. Again, I see nothing. I decided to let it rest and just get used to it. But it kept happening until my patience was again gone. I go out onto the balcony another night, but this time I pay attention to the whole area as the sound is going by. All the balconies, the roof of the buildings, and then I see it. Through the gap between the buildings in the corner of the garden, I see, for a split second, this dude in a black winter jacket pulling a small cart behind him. I smile to myself and think, son of a bitch, and go back to sleep like a baby. This happened when I was 18. Me and a workmate were working late. We worked at a restaurant called Valentine's. I was letting out the last customers before closing for the night. I thanked them and locked all the doors in the restaurant so we could start cleaning up. It was raining heavily and it was stormy weather, which isn't out of the ordinary for New Zealand, but it was crazy and creeped us workers out because the power and lights kept flicking on and off. Me and my mate were the last workers to finish up. My mate, being the manager, had told everyone to finish up since we didn't have a lot to do, but asked if one of us could stay. I offered to stay. We were having a good old laugh and chat, and I would say we'd been cleaning for about an hour, until we heard a massive bang in the reception area. It sounded like the door. A guy came running in, asking if he could use the bathroom, and he looked desperate, soaked to the bone and sad looking like he'd been crying. So me and my mate said okay, sure. I thought to myself, I'm sure I locked the door. Maybe the crazy wind blew it open. I went and shut the door, but didn't lock it, so the guy who ran in could get out. Me and my mate decided to have a break, so we sat down, started eating and talked for a good 30 minutes. And then we both noticed that the guy that wanted to use the bathroom hadn't come out yet. My mate went to check on him and said he wasn't in the toilet. So we kind of assumed he ducked out without us knowing. So I went back to the door, left unlocked, and locked it. Within those few minutes I was walking back to the table to finish my meal, the door smashed open again and the same guy came in asking the same thing. I was kind of creeped out. I turned to my mate who was freaked out more than I was, and my friend was signaling me to look into the tinted windows that were in front of me. The lights started flickering, on and off again, which made it hard for me to figure out what my friend was trying to signal me to do. I looked behind me and the guy was still standing there. I turned and looked in the window and noticed the person had no reflection. My heart was racing and I kept my eyes on my friend. We both said he could use the toilet. My friend is psychic or has some gift. Said the third time around isn't a good sign, so he told me to leave everything and we locked the restaurant immediately. Nothing ever happened after that, but it was creepy. It's probably the only intense experience I've had. Later on, we discovered that the theme park that it's built across the road from, the restaurants also experienced things as well. They've had more bad ones where workers would end up sick. Some say it's because it's built on an old cemetery. I'm 30 right now, and I still remember it as if it happened yesterday. When I was younger, my mum unknowingly gave me her old Ouija board, the one she used when she was a kid, so around sometime in the 80s. I started playing around with it when I was probably 11 or 12. Anyways, I'd always been fascinated with ghosts and spirits, anything to do with the paranormal. Although I didn't really know much about Ouija boards then. I also didn't know how to properly use one. So long story short, I think as a kid I might have let lots of spirits through or something. Because since then, I've had lots of unexplainable experience. There's always one that comes to mind. It was around the time I was about to move, because for some reason, that increased the activity. Anyways, my mum was out to get teriyaki for dinner, and I was watching television in the living room. It was around 6 PM in the evening. I was laying on the couch watching my favourite cartoon, when I got this feeling of panic. I felt as if something was watching me. I even heard the floor creaking like there was someone in the bathroom hallway. I remember turning down the TV and looking over at the other couch, where my two dogs were momentarily sleeping, their ears slightly shifting around. I heard what I thought sounded like the closet doors slowly open, and all of a sudden, I heard a loud thump. My dogs woke up and frantically jumped off the couch and started barking. They started running from the front door like someone was there. I quickly sat up and turned around. I was expecting to be met with something or someone, and all I see is my Ouija board, laying right beside the rug in the walkway of the living room, which was about 12 to 15 feet away from the closet, by the bathroom. I remember picking up the board shortly after and putting it back in the closet. Overall, it was pretty fucking scary and left me visibly shaken to my mother. After that experience, which I believe was in 2015 or 16, I learned how to properly use a Ouija board. It was the summer of 2015. I was about to move out of the city and into the mountains with my mom. It was late at night, and I was getting ready for bed. The condo we lived in would make me feel very unsafe at night, specifically the downstairs, which is where the two bedrooms were. I'd almost always have these vivid night terrors. In my night terrors, I'd be visited by a shadow man, dressed in all black, who would slowly chase me around the woods of my house, and he'd eventually kill me in these very unpleasant and painful ways. He would almost always come out of this small room behind the washer and dryer, in the hallway. The room scared me shitless. It was a small, dark cement room under the stairs. I had no idea what it was there for or why. It was sad we were moving, but I was glad to be getting the fuck out. I decided to sleep on the couch on my last night in my old house, mainly because my bed was already in a moving truck. I remember putting my pyjamas on and heading upstairs with the worst feeling that someone was right behind me. I ran up the stairs. I flopped onto the couch and wrapped the semi-see-through sheet over my body. It almost felt like my heart was about to beat out of my chest. I was petrified. I heard soft and slow footsteps make their way to me. I remember crying and trying to convince myself it was my dog. Shortly after, I saw a handprint push into the sheet cocoon I had wrapped myself in. I remember telling it to go away and closing my eyes and continuing to cry until I passed out. Still to this day, weird things happen in my home. I've seen the same shadow apparition of a tall man, about 6'7", in what looks to be a Western-style hat, with what kind of looks like a duster. He'd stand or walk outside my room in the hallway and whistle eerily and off-key. I've even once had two friends who I was FaceTiming hear the apparition/shadow man walking around my hallway, whistling. Sometimes he would even mess with my electricity or electronics. Hell, I had two perfectly working iPhones suddenly start acting crazy and eventually end up breaking. One of which I had a 15-second video where I caught the whistling outside my window. I even remember frantically sending it to one of my friends who I had previously told about the haunting/weird experiences. Sometimes I'd also hear scratching in my walls, yet there's no room for anyone. There's no rodents either. Recently I've gotten Wicca,
So I've been burning protective herbs, incense and such. Thankfully, the activity has since significantly died down. But every so often, I still hear whistling in the woods, in my front yard or right outside my window. Even my mom and my animals hear it. I'm not quite sure what this is. A spirit? A demon? If I'm being completely transparent, I got into the occult when I was young, around 12 to be specific. I didn't know what I was really getting into. Perhaps that could have been the cause? I'm still not sure. A couple of years ago, I had my first paranormal encounter, and the only one I remember that I'm not that skeptical about. Again, I don't remember the exact details because I was very young at the time. All I remember is me going out of my room in the middle of the night, or in the very early morning. It was very dark, so it's one of the two, and standing in our hallway. I live in a 3-story building, counting the basement, and all our rooms, my parents' and brother's rooms, are upstairs. So we have this little space-like hallway in the middle of our doors to our rooms. So no matter what room you're in, you can open the doors and look down the stairs. I was standing in that hallway-like space, and I looked down the stairs, and I saw what I remember looking like my dad at the top of the stairs. The position he was in was a crawling-like position, and I only remember seeing the top of his torso and his head, of course. Now the weird thing about it was that he was glowing white. He was white like a piece of paper, and the lines on his body that made out the nose, eyes and hair was a blue-like colour. I just stared at him and he stared back. Nobody said anything, not even me. I just stared. I think I stared for 15 to 20 seconds before going on with my business. I don't remember what I was doing. Maybe I was going to the toilet or waking up my brother. I don't remember. But I do remember checking the stairs while going back and he was gone. I told it to my parents the next day, but my dad told me he didn't leave the bed that night. I swear I've been a paranormal magnet since I exited the womb. Let me tell you. I have an entire note section in my phone of experiences that I can remember, and because I have so many, it's difficult to really scare me anymore. Part of this story freaks me out a lot. It started in 2017. The activity in the house started to pick up more than usual that year, so seeing and hearing things just became a part of my day, and I never thought twice about any of it. One night in September, I went to bed early because I felt sick and had plans the next day. Now, I'm not someone who was blessed with the ability to fall asleep instantly. So after about 20 minutes of laying with my eyes closed, I felt the corner of my bed dip down. I felt the dip move along the edge of my bed, up to my utter back, where it stopped for a second. Then it went back to the door. I was a teenager with a horrendously messy room, so I just thought it was one of my parents coming in to get something I borrowed. And they were using the bed to not trip over anything. I turned my focus back to sleeping and felt the movement again. Still convinced it was a parent struggling to find something, I laid there. But after the third time, I realised I never heard my door open. I immediately sat up to find myself alone in my room, with the door obviously still closed. I was freaked out but felt like shit, so I laid back down and tried to ignore it when it started moving again. Eventually, I finally fell asleep. For the next year or so, at least once a week, I would feel something jump onto the end of my bed and walk around a little before laying across my legs. I could even feel the heartbeat of whatever it was. It would only happen while I was trying to fall asleep, but later it started walking around even if I was wide awake. It would only stop if I turned to look at it. With the earlier behaviour and my mom telling me she once heard scratching from the inside of my door at 6 a.m. one morning, we assumed it was a dog. My childhood dog passed away long ago, so I didn't know who it could be. But it became an almost nightly routine that I soon found comfort in. However, one night, I woke up to the feeling of a full human laying next to me. The whole side of my bed was dipped down as if someone was there. My bed is only a twin bed, so trust me, you feel anything and everything. But I wasn't scared at all, and just went back to sleep. A year later, we moved to a new house. And this is where my comfort of a ghost dog was replaced with confusion. It became a nightly thing. What used to be a bit of walking, then laying down and sleeping with me, turned into constant moving. It was no longer the feeling of a larger dog laying across my calves. It was the feeling of my entire legs and lower back being pushed into the bed. Some nights I feel the one dog walking, but more often than not, I now feel multiple smaller things walking around at the same time. Or I feel let's say human for the sake of my sanity. Just imagine someone standing at the end of your bed, putting their hands on either side of your body, and climbing onto the bed on top of you. Yeah, don't know what the fuck that's about, but okay. My mom told me I should try recording it one night to see if I could see the bed moving. Since I'm the only one who experiences this. So about a year and a half ago, while I was watching YouTube on my iPad before bed, I felt it come up. I was laying on my stomach. Without turning around, I grabbed my phone next to me and it was still walking. As soon as I opened the camera, it stopped. So I waited again, and when I felt it, I hit record and pointed the camera at the end of my bed. It walked for a little bit and stopped again. So I tried to watch the video, but I had so many blankets you couldn't see anything. I was going to try again, but it stopped for the night. I didn't sleep for 3 days starting that night. I was waking up every 45 minutes, panicked. And I mean like heavy breathing, almost crying panicked. I feared falling asleep. Every time I woke up, I would turn on my flashlight and stare at my closet. Yeah, closets are creepy, but I was terrified of it and had no idea why. So the next 2 nights I stayed up as late as I could. So the little bit of sleep I did get would be during the lighter hours of the early morning. The 4th night I was completely fine. Slept perfectly fine and had no worries about the closet. I was alone in my bed those 3 nights. I've slept with the lights on almost every night since then. Aside from the dog turning into a human and the multiple smaller things, this was what really made me think, okay, so maybe the dog assumption was correct. 2 weeks later, I woke up in the middle of the night. When I was a kid, I had a weird thing where at least once every couple of weeks, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, hallucinate bugs everywhere around me, and throw myself out of bed. This was my first time doing it again in years. That morning, I woke up with a giant bruise on my inner leg. I know I didn't hit anything that night, because there was literally nothing for me to hit besides the door. This bruise was immediately bright purple and blue. Hurt so bad to even lightly touch and took a good 2+ weeks to go away. Like there's no way I wouldn't have felt it. Sometime after that, I can't remember exactly when, I was trying to sleep and whatever it was would not sit still and I was getting annoyed. So I said something like, yeah, right buddy, I'm going to need you to sit down or fuck off. I want to sleep. And it stopped for a second. Then there was a loud growl directly into my ear. For some reason I wasn't scared, so I just laughed at it and went to sleep. Other than the aggressive nightly walking around my bed, the most recent thing was a couple months ago, where I was sleeping, but I woke up and couldn't open my eyes or move. I felt like whatever it was in its human form pinning me down. After a few seconds of trying to violently move my body, I finally moved and could open my eyes, so that was fun. I have so many other stories, but they're all just like, haha, today this happened. While this is an ongoing, more interesting thing, I guess. But maybe I'll share more in the future.